It's time to gather loved ones together for all the holidays' best spread. Lynn's has great prices on all your favorite Thanksgiving items, from delicious turkey with all the fixings to mashed potatoes and yummy pies. We have everything you need to create your perfect Thanksgiving dinner. Whether it's cooking the traditional meal, completely store-bought, or a combination of both, your best holiday meal starts here. Learn more and start shopping today at lynsgrocery.com. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
The views and opinions expressed by A Little Bit Culty are those of the hosts and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast.
That's true.
Any of the fire content provided by our guests, bloggers, sponsors, or authors are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything.
Unless you're abusing people, then I have a problem maligning you.
Also, we're not doctors, psychologists, or wizards. We're just two non-experts trying to make you a friendly, informative podcast that helps you understand culty shit. Hey everybody, Sarah Edmondson here.
And I'm Anthony Ames, aka Nippy, Sarah's husband, and you're listening to
A Little Bit Culty,
aka ALBC, a podcast about what happens when devotion goes to the dark side.
We've been there and back again. A little about us. True story, we met and fell in love in a cult. And then we woke up and got the hell out of Dodge.
And the whole thing was captured in the HBO docuseries The Vow, now in its second season.
I also wrote about our experience in my memoir, Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life.
Look at us, a couple of married podcasters who just happen to have a weekly date night where we interview experts and advocates in things like cult awareness and mind control.
Wait. This does not count toward date night, babe. We got to schedule that. That's separate.
So there's 2 days we got to hang out?
We do this podcast thing because we learned a lot on our exit ramp out of NXIVM, still on that journey, and we want to pay the lessons forward with the help of other cult survivors and whistleblowers.
We know all too well that culty things happen. It happens to people every day across every walk of life. So join us each week to tackle these culty dynamics, everywhere from online dating to mega churches and multi-level marketing.
This stuff really is everywhere. The cultiverse just keeps on expanding, and so are we. Welcome to Season 5 of A Little Bit Culty, serving cult content and word salads weekly on your favorite podcast platforms. Learn more at alittlebitculty.com.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Welcome back to A Little Bit Culty. Thank you guys for going on this journey with us. I have a feeling that some of you don't listen to the end, so I'm going to say something up front, which is if you're appreciating this show and you are getting value out of it, we'd love to see you over on Patreon, where we have lots of bonus content and goodies and debriefs and
A little more word salad.
more word salads. I think it'll make it worth it. It really does allow us to keep going, and we appreciate it.
Sarah lets her hair down.
I let my hair down a little bit. It's just lovely.
Shakes it out and lets it out.
It danced to
It's
Taylor
great.
Swift, and
Yeah.
so does Nippy.
I saw Nikki Glazer do a roast. Oh, it was a roast of Jewel. And she's like, Jewel's here tonight, or as I like to say, Trailer Swift.
I don't get it.
You don't get it?
No.
I'll let our audience tell you.
On that note, we just actually recorded with our guest, and I keep thinking I'm not going to get emotional in this one. And then
It took you to the end.
I got it all the way to the very
went
end.
to the end, and then you, true to form, you announced it. And I hid my emotions.
Just so you know, Nippy doesn't have a problem with me getting emotional. He has a problem with me announcing it.
No, it's great. I think
But that's part of, for me, being emotional.
I hid mine. I suppressed it and pretended it wasn't there, like every
Yeah,
man
and
does.
in my culture, it's actually called, in Yiddish, it's kvelling. I kvel. And you say, oh, I'm kvelling. So I say I have to express that I'm emotional. It's part of the experience for me.
Cavelling doesn't sound like the appropriate word, but we'll leave it there.
It's Yiddish.
There's no segue yet,
No
so we're just
segue.
going to launch right in. But I will say this, Dwight York is like a page out of Keith Raniere.
They don't know who Dwight York is. Well, we didn't know who Dwight York was.
I didn't know who Dwight York was, and that's one of the things I was thinking about beforehand is how the hell do I know who this guy is? I mean, it happened, 20-something years ago, but it seems to me there's a lot of parallels in his case to Keith's in terms of abuses of power.
Being a philosophical teacher and abusing people. And his sentence, which we'll get to, is over Keith's.
135.
135. Does he have any probation?
I don't know if he has any probation, but I know that he's getting out in 2120.
Let's set the scene. So Christmas time, 1978, New York. Jamiyla Chisholm's mother, whom we'll call Umi, decided she was going to quit her job and become a Muslim. She packed 3 outfits in a small bag with some sanitary napkins, some underwear and socks, and a toothbrush before heading out with her 2-year-old daughter, Jamiyla, to somewhere only referred to as the Community in Brooklyn, New York.
It had been Jamila's father's idea, who became excited after regularly visiting a mosque that, as Jamiyla writes in her recent memoir titled The Community, could tell her family how they, quote, should live as Black people, end quote.
If you're familiar with the vibes on this show, you'll already know that things didn't work out quite as planned. In her memoir, Jamiyla tells the harrowing story of her family's indoctrination into what she eventually understood to be a religious cult. The cult's leader, whom they called Imam Isa at the time, separated her from her parents and unleashed horrific abuse upon all of his followers in the coming years. Several decades after having unknowingly joined a cult as a little girl and thankfully leaving, Jamiyla decided to finally ask Umi about what had really happened and why.
True to form with these stories, it's interesting to note how much politics and racial tensions were involved. The story really plugs into the state of the USA both then and now, and because there's no one who can speak to that better than Jamiyla herself, we're thrilled to have her on our show today.
And so we'd like to welcome author, journalist, storyteller, and educator Jamiyla Chisholm onto the show to tell us her very important story. Good morning, Jamiyla.
Good morning, Sarah.
Welcome to A Little Bit Culty, finally.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. And yes, finally to sit down and talk to you.
I think it probably took maybe 85 to 100 emails between myself and your publicist to make it happen. It's mostly my fault.
It was an exercise in tenacity.
Yes. How do you like to introduce yourself? What's your elevator pitch regarding this book and you in this world right now?
I'm Jamiyla Chisholm. I am a writer, a storyteller. I think of myself as a creative or creator. Not quite sure what the terminology is there. I'm also an educator. So I work full-time telling stories with Barnard College in New York City, but I also teach at Columbia University and Baruch College. I teach storytelling, actually, at both of those places. I am a native New Yorker. I love being a native New Yorker, and I don't know what else to say.
And your book is so good. We literally just finished, I know Courtney sent me a hard copy, but I like to listen. And it was a really well-read Audible. I also do voiceover for a living, so I listen for these things. Your narrator did an incredible job. Your writing is really beautiful and descriptive of something that I feel like must have been so hard to write about since you were so young when you were in the community, which we will talk about. But I feel like it's so much more than a book about, I mean, obviously we're here on A Little Bit Culty. It's so much more than a cult. It's about the cultural and political landscape. It's about your family. It's about identity. It's about love. It's just like, it was really gripping.
To finish your commentary, the parallels of the abuses that went on in there, that go on in our culture, are really the lane that I love to draw the parallels from so people can relate. You did that so well. So it was really good. And with the language and that I hadn't heard it put to, particularly Sarah I just listened to your epilogue. So I'll let you take over.
Thank you. Thank you. That means so much. I think as a writer, one never knows what the outcome might be, right? How it might land with readers. You're absolutely right that the through line of what was happening within the community, behind the gates with the people who were a part of this movement, which I need to say was officially called the Ansarul Allah community. And we called it the community for short. No one was going to say all of that all the time. And also, the idea of calling it the community helped to reinforce what the people were trying to do, which was build, right, a community within a space that turned out to be something else, which is, the whole point of the story. But the through line that I was also exploring was that culturally in the United States, right, there were all of these issues racially and culturally and maybe even gender and religiously around the 70s that I realized is what inspired this group to actually form this community, right? Like there was a sense of disenfranchisement. There was a sense of a lack of power, a lack of agency within themselves and within their own family and within their, siloed communities within, Black communities across the nation. The irony for me, though, is that once we get inside of this community, there is a mirror that is happening from the oppression that these people, my family included, were trying to escape. And they landed in that boiling frog pot of hot water. And I don't think the people, once they were in this hot water, understood that what they were trying to escape is where they landed. So that was something that parallel world, that parallel universe was something that was very stark to me as a child. I don't know why, honestly. I was able to recognize it and a lot of adults were not, but I think maybe because it wasn't my choice to move into this place, right? So I could view it with a level of objectivity that the adults may not have had at their disposal. So yes, once I saw, oh my gosh, this is kind of like a neo-slavery situation that we have moved into. Once that became clear to me, then I just needed to unspool that thread. And the point for me was to understand the why. I really wanted to know why, how could a place like this exist? But the answer to that was, what was the need?
Right. Well, that's actually always our first question for guests. And usually our guests are those who, not always, but chose something. You were brought in, you didn't choose. What did your parents, and I guess it was mostly your father who, 100% your father that led this decision. And then, so like, what was he choosing and what did he think he was signing up for? I'd also love you to talk about your mom, because I think what your book does so beautifully is share her childhood tapestry and how that formulated her, I don't want to use the word vulnerabilities because people interpret that differently, but basically what made her susceptible to not say, screw this. Like this is not okay. But let's start with your dad because he led the charge.
I think for my father, I think what he was looking for was what a lot of young Black men during that time, and that time being the 70s, he and my mom, but I think more so him because they had very different upbringings and childhood experiences, which I can explain a little bit. But for my father, and I think maybe being a man or a young man in this world and seeing what the energy was of the 1960s, just how contentious it was culturally and how, there were literal marches and protests, with young men wearing signages saying, I am a man, right? Something just as simple as, please see me as the person who I am. And so if I think about what was happening culturally at that moment, which was a lot, and his own headspace of coming from a family where he was the only boy in this family. He had a lot of agency within his family, but not so much, I would imagine, in the world, in New York City, in the United States. And what the community was offering a lot of young Black men was exactly what they did not have out in the world, which was agency, self-empowerment, a voice. And I think that that's what he thought was being offered to him, was some self-empowerment. He might have gotten some of that, but I don't think he got everything that he thought he was going to get, which is, the narrative of most cults. There's a smoke and mirrors dance that happens. So, things sound really, really good until you get behind the door. And then once that key is turned, it's a clown show. For my mom was very, very much, and she still is this person to this day, but she is very much driven by family and by not only the concept, but the actual physical need to have family. And so both of my parents, they were quite young when they decided to start a family.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how old was your dad and your mom at the time?
Early 20s. So he probably might have heard about the place initially, maybe in his late teens.
Okay.
Took some time studying what this place was, someone close to him constantly feeding him, propagandizing. And then eventually, he decides, yes, I'm going to make this move. And when he decided, I'm thinking, just trying to do the math here, my mom I was 2. That made her 21, 22 years old. That made him 23, 24. So they were under
You're young.
25 children in my eyes.
Yeah,
Very,
formidable.
very,
Yeah.
the age that I am now, I think, oh gosh, they were kids,
Yeah.
But for my mom, yeah, it wasn't just that yet. Obviously, they were young, very young adults, but also her extreme drive to not have her family broken apart, to keep her family together by any means necessary. And I think also, honestly, she was not as well informed about what this place was as my father was. I'd like to say that. So she really kind of, I think, took his word for it, that this would be a place where we could still have a nuclear family. We would be together. The only difference is that we would become Muslims. It was just a changing of religion as my mom saw it, but it was an absolute changing of our way of life.
And what was the promise of that in terms of the core philosophy?
My understanding was self-autonomy and the ability to have no government, no outside forces tell us how to be, how to raise our children, how to love each other, how to practice our religion, how to dress, what to eat. We get to be our own people. I don't think there's any sexier way to say that.
I don't think it needs to be sexier. I think you look at any sort of thing throughout history, even allegedly how America became America, it was one group of people telling another oppressive group of people, you don't get to tell us how we're going to live our lives.
And I think that it's so easy to capitalize, I think, on a group of people who have historically been disenfranchised. And a person, if they are smart enough and if they've done their homework well enough, and if they know the history, they can maybe ride in on a white horse and try to save the day, and tell these people who have been historically told, be quiet, you have no rights here, and tell them the complete opposite of that. And I think that for people like my father specifically, that was really, really what was needed at that time. And what else was there, right? I can either go to this space where this man who looks like me and who is telling me the things that I want to hear, I can either go here or stay out in this cesspool of struggle where no one is listening to me.
That's why I played your epilogue again for Nippy just now before we jumped on, because I really felt the depth of that. You called it cultural vulnerability at the end of the book. And I feel like that's why this episode is very important, specifically in a way that I hadn't connected the dots before. In regards to a lot of things, when people reach out to us with new content to cover, I've generally heard of it. And I hadn't heard about Dwight. I mean, we're not cult experts. We didn't go to school for this. We just had our own experience and now we have this podcast. But I generally feel like, even though we haven't done a deep dive on Jim Jones, I know who he is and it's referenced a lot. And I hadn't heard much about Dwight York.
Well, the tactics are the same. I mean, Jim Jones, when I read about Jim Jones, one of the people that he targeted specifically was Black women. And Black women, he used the disenfranchisement as leverage to enroll them. And my experience, I don't know if you experienced this, Sarah, is one of the things that, and it's going on a lot right now because particularly economically things are hard. And that traditionally makes people susceptible to alternative ways where they can feel like there's a place to thrive. And you're seeing extremes in our culture right now. So I think that's a very important thing to establish is the ecosystem. A lot of these people, particularly at that age, your 20s. That's why I asked that age, because that's when you're going, what are the next 30, 40, 50 years going to look like? Where's there a structure that I can go and thrive in?
Right. Who do I think I am?
Yes.
Exactly. Right. Who do I want to be? It's a very formative time for us. Right. And oftentimes around that age, we're seeking. It is definitely a time of self-discovery, right? And a time of finding one's voice and one's place in this world. Right. And, depending, I think, on, what one's foundation is, we either go back, right? Like back to our nuclear family, because that's who we know, we're comfortable there, right? Or we say, nope, I'm going the opposite way, right? At least I know from my mom, that's what my mom did, but she didn't have much of a family foundation to begin with, So yeah, it's such a formative time. And if there's very little guidance, around that age, I think it can be a scary time for young adults who really just want to try out different flavors, and they have absolutely every right to do so, right? We should be able to try everything out that feels safe and comfortable, but realizing belatedly when this thing that we're trying out is harming us or harming our communities, right? I think that takes a lot more maturity and a lot more nuance of understanding.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard to see, especially when, I'll speak for myself as well, totally different circumstances, obviously, but there's this, like you said, running the opposite way, there's an individuation there, right? So when you individuate and you choose something, you kind of got to stick to your guns, because otherwise you've made a big mistake, right?
And no one wants to do that,
No. Oh, I made a good choice. I'm really happy here in this big white house and sleeping on the floor. So wait, tell me, by the way, Nippy and I were laughing at my princessness, because, everyone, when they hear about our story or any cult, has a point where they're like, oh, I would never do that. And people say that to us all the time, right? Like, I would never do that. And then I'm like, and then they tell me about some other thing that they do that's totally culty. And I'm like, okay, right? So everyone has their thing. For me, because I'm such a princess, I'd be like, I'm not sleeping on the floor. I am out, right? Like, but that's my line, where other people would have been like, I'm not wearing a sash. You're ridiculous, as in our case. So tell me about what your mom saw, and like, what were some of the red flags that she had to ignore so that she could make her decision a good one?
My mom is a princess.
Yes. Well, kudos to her for getting through it for 2 years. I would not have lasted a night.
It's one of the things that I really find so fascinating about her endurance. I'm just like, you did this for how long? And the whole time in the back of her head, she's like, why am I doing this? Like, there's a scene that I write about in the book, a whole scene around a mattress, right? Speaking of floors, my mom, when we moved, she moved with a mattress, a physical mattress that she had shipped from the Bronx to Brooklyn. And she did not know, because, let me back up. She thought erroneously that we, my father, her, and myself, would have our own apartment. So that was what she thought when we rang the doorbell of the community. So that is why she thought that she could have a mattress in this space. So the mattress comes, but there's nowhere to really put the mattress, because what she soon discovers, as I soon discovered for myself also, is that there is no family apartment. There are rooms that people are broken up and down into. So my mom walks into a room that she is expected to share with about, half a dozen women. So within that space, imagine, where's a mattress going? Nowhere. So what she then witnessed when she walked into this room was, her first question was, well, how do you fit so many adults in such a small space? How are we supposed to live and cohabitate in this space? And what she saw was a kind of new city, honestly, that the women whom she was sharing this space with, that they had created within this room. There are crates, maybe milk carton crates, that have now turned into little cubbies for them to store their personal belongings. Crates that have turned into, that have doubled as bed foundations, So if you happen to have had a really small mattress, you could elevate your mattress off the floor, right? That was a little bit of luxury that people creatively thought of. My mom saw clothing lines strung up around the room so that women could dry their clothes, their undergarments in the room because there was nowhere else to do these things. She learned that she would soon be hungry a lot because food was rationed. Actually, everything was rationed, food as well as personal, much needed garments like sanitary napkins for women. Sex was rationed when couples got the opportunity to have sex with each other. So what she learned was that she had moved her family into a world of extreme restrictions and lack. That is the word that I'm looking for.
Scarcity.
Scarcity, yes. Yeah, scarcity and lack. I think scarcity is one thing, but I think lack is you just don't have it, right? Scarcity is you might have a little bit of it, whereas, the lack of food, the lack of clothing. I know for myself, I had 2 outfits that I rotated through. The shoes, I had 1 pair of shoes. And I know some people might say, well, how much does a 2-year-old need, right? But children normally have different attire for different situations. There's play, right? There's sleep, there's school. There are different things for how we dress. And we did not have any variations in what our activities were. So there weren't any variations really in what the clothing was. We didn't need much because we didn't do a lot of things. We actually didn't even leave the compound, the women and the children. So I guess we didn't need much of clothing or shoes anyway. The world wasn't seeing us.
Just for our listeners, she was not told any of this. She found this out when she got there.
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
I believe that my father was a lot more knowledgeable about what this ecosystem was and the way it worked. Whereas my mom, I think what she knew was that we were going to become Muslims. I know that sounds very juvenile and questionable. I questioned her very much so, which is in the book, my constant need to understand how she was so easily, and my feelings then so easily duped. But now, after having done the research, obviously, and spoken with her over and over and over and over a year, actually, of interviewing her, I understand how things were presented to her and also how busy she was personally as a working mom, that she did not think I need to take time out of my life to research this place that I'm going to move into.
This is the golden age of cult recovery. The more we speak up and share our stories, the more we realize we are not alone. Your voice and your story can empower others. This is Sarah, and I'm proud to be a founding collaborator of the #IGotOut movement. Learn more at igotout.org.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
One of the things that I love so much about your book is that part of it is your journey of understanding. As somebody who was brought there and also left quite young, but those are, I think probably know better than most people how formative those years are and how that affected you, affected your dreams, affected your emotions, affected your view of yourself, affected the world. And so much of the book is that journey in a way that I think that many people will be able to relate to, even though the circumstances are so different in terms of that self-discovery and the forgiveness and all of those elements.
You know, when you're seeking to understand someone and their perspective of how they make these decisions, normally you come down to their intent was normally pretty good. And it becomes difficult to maintain anger or whatever it is once you're able to humanize a very human decision and see the ecosystem in which they're making those decisions, and maybe even some of the blind spots and mistakes that they made, you know. And one of the ones I'm hearing is like, I can speak for myself, and this is when making a decision like that, when you outsource your trust to someone of maybe doing the research or something like that, it can normally lead to a bad decision. And in my case, you know, I trusted someone, you know, and it sounded like your mom trusted your father with that, and then found themselves in a situation and maybe not even recognizing that was the origin of the decision later on until they go back and do the work to trace, you know what, this was a choice point for me where I made a decision that wasn't best for me and the people around me.
I do want to jump in on that because I think that is, for me, it was it was like the screw that I kept turning, because for years the narrative from my mom was, well, I was following my husband. And I saw it as a cop-out, honestly. You know, I love them both, and I love my mom more than anything in this world. But I thought she was being unfair to herself by saying she did not have any agency. She did make a decision. And that was the thing that I eventually wanted her to own up to, was whether to say yay or nay is making a decision. And whatever the outcome is, she may not have expected it to have been as awful as it was. And no, she did not want to risk losing my father, right? And the dissolution of our family, but that happened anyway. So decisions, you know, when we all make decisions, right? And I think it is important for us to acknowledge them, because that's then, to me, is when the healing can happen, is when we can actually say, yeah, I did that. Now, why did I do that? What was the impetus behind it? What was driving me?
And it seems in your book, and I don't want to ruin it for our listeners, but one of the more powerful moments was, it seemed to me you understood that she made it from love and community.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And your father's was different.
Yes. You know, it's interesting. From the beginning, they were moving in two different directions. You know, their intentions were very different. Had they communicated that to each other, there might have been an aha moment.
Well, they didn't have a lot of time together.
They did not.
No.
They did not. Yeah.
And before we get to that stage, can you just fill us in a little bit? I mean, we've read the book, but for those who haven't yet, obviously we highly recommend it. But paint a little bit of a picture of what the day-to-day was like inside this White House and these walls.
Yeah. Yeah. The day to day, as I said earlier, you know, we didn't have a lot to do, but what we did do, it was always regimented. It was very much like being little baby soldiers. I think I might have used that term in the book, actually. So I will start with the children. And with my cohort, we were broken up, everybody, into every possible category that you could think of. So when I arrived, I was with a room full of toddler girls. Boys were separated from girls, just like the women were separated from men. And then everybody was separated from each other. So I never got to see what happened with my parents, what their day-to-days were like. And the reason for that was because I eventually got new guardians. I had these 4 aunts who we called UMS, UMS, and they were essentially the guardians of my group. The older I got, I then graduated into an older group. So what it was is we would wake up early, we would cleanse ourselves. Oftentimes, there would be 3 little girls at once, either in the tub trying to clean up or at the sink, because there were maybe 40 to 50 of us in this room. So we're on a schedule. We have got to get to school. We did go to Arabic school. I learned Arabic because English was forbidden. So we did not speak English at all. None of my none of the kids. My mom, she did not speak Arabic. So she had her own language struggles there, which I can't imagine was fun for her. So I would go to Arabic school, and it was a real school within the community. I could see the little wooden desks if I like envision the room. And, there would be a teacher. And then after that, we would have time for play. So there was a playground that was also built onto the back of the children's house. The children's house was literally a big house, and it was divided up for the different age groups of the children. So maybe one floor was where the young kids resided, including myself. Maybe another floor was where infants resided. And another floor was maybe where, kindergarten age children, so that was kind of the layout of everything. And so we had this playground that was built to the back of the house. And then the kids would have an opportunity, maybe an hour, I'm not quite sure, to just let off steam. We got to run around in this playground, and we would not interact with each other, really. I remember that. And I think it was because we were terrified of showing fun in any way possible. So we would just, at least for myself, I played alone often. We would return, and then several times throughout the day, there would be time for prayer. In the Islamic tradition, Muslims make salat 5 times a day. So there would be time throughout the day for us to have prayer time. And we always ended the day, usually, if I'm remembering this correctly, and my memory might be really foggy here, but we had a prayer room in the basement. In my mind, it was in the basement of one of these houses. I think it was the children's house, so that the children would never have to leave the house. That was our world, honestly. It was this house and that playground. And then we would say prayer. Prayer in this circumstance, we would get to see everyone. So we would get to be in the room with other kids. It was a mixed gendered space, but still segregated within prayer. Men prayed at the head. Women prayed behind them. Boys prayed behind the women. And we little girls got to pull up the rear in prayer. And then once prayer was over, everybody would disperse back to their respective rooms. And my group would end the night on a blue gymnasium mat. We did not have beds. We slept on a mat on the floor, and we would huddle and watch Tom and Jerry. We would watch cartoons, and we'd have our dinner, and night, start the whole ritual of that world all over again. For my mom, though, my mom worked. She was a worker bee within this world. She had a lot of different jobs over the time that she was there, but her main job was to be an for infants and toddlers. She really disliked taking care of the toddlers, but she really liked being with infants. So she and another woman whereas there were 40 to 50 girls that I stayed in a room with and slept with, my mom and another woman would care for about 8 babies in one room. So she described that there would be 3 babies in one crib.
So she's raising 8 other kids and not her own.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. So she would women would literally give birth and bring their kids, their babies, their infants, their newborns to my mom, who would then be responsible for taking care of them. And these new moms, their opportunity to see their babies was during nursing time.
Now, how involved was Dwight with this and with the design of it? And do you think it was intentional, or do you think it was negligence and he gave little resources to it? Or what level of psychopathy do you think it was operating at to be like, I want to do this to stress them on purpose, or I just don't have the resources, you guys figure it out?
He was the kingmaker and the brain behind the community, behind Ansaru Allah. He was the quote unquote imam. He ran this place. No one did anything without his approval unless they were sneaking, honestly. And it was about breaking the rules if a person did something that was not what the Dwight York mandate was. So this was his design, even down to the teachings, even down to the literature that he produced and published. Those were all his words. You know, he wrote everything. He was in charge of his image. He was in charge. So when I say that food was rationed, he was the one people had to go to and say, I'm hungry. I need socks. I need to leave the compound so I could cash a welfare check. All of this went through him and then it trickled down. So he was the voice of God in this place. It was even him, my mom said, who gave the okay for when couples could have sex. It was him. He said, okay, so I'm going to now open the rooms. And when he felt like it, he would close the rooms. That meant no sex. So this was his design from A to Z. He was very much in charge. And when it comes to the psychopathy behind it, when I think about what happened when he formed the Nuwaubian Nation in Georgia, right? This was 20 years after the community.
93.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
20 years after my family, you know, that when he formed this place, even, you know, I worked on an article about it once. The FBI raided his compound in Macon, Georgia, and the Nuwaubian Nation then dissolved. But people were terrified to speak about him. People were terrified to speak about their experiences. And he was arrested, looking at, you know, decades of imprisonment. He had abused or was accused of abusing hundreds of children, some as young as 5 years old. This is the level of insanity that York brought everywhere he went, you know, and he used children, sadly, as his pawns. This was, I think, how he obviously was able to get the parents to almost do anything that he wanted them to do. We were his hostages.
I want to talk more about that. Before we do, I know I asked what your mother's first red flags were. Do you remember what your first WTF moment was that you had to squelch?
Yeah, it was when I realized that my mom was not going to be with me, full stop. And that was on day one. That was on day one when I was shown my room and my mom walked in the opposite direction. And my mom actually asked, so we will not get to be together. And when the woman said no, that's when I understood exactly then that I was in trouble. Like my life was about to become something that I could not have foreseen and that I did not know how I was going to navigate. You know, I had come from a very nuclear space where I was an only child. I was her joy. We loved each other immensely. You know, my mom worked really, really hard to make sure that I was okay as a child. So to lose her, to not have access to her, it hit me that moment. I knew that this was not a good place. Because for me, any place that was taking my mom away from me was not just on a very elementary level, this was not good. I mean, everything else that happened afterwards just solidified for me that I was in a hellscape. At least that's how I interpreted it. You know, I'm sure there were maybe some other kids who did not feel as awful about the place as I did. You know, that's perspective. And we all have it. We all have our own experiences. But for me, losing my mom was devastating. And I knew, I just knew instantly, this isn't good. And I think she knew also. But I think for her, you know, I think she tried to intellectualize it, you know, and said, well, if this is the way things are, right, then I'm not being slighted. This is the system. My 2-year-old brain did not see a system.
No.
You know,
Right.
I saw
Right.
personal slight. I saw
Yeah.
you're taking my mom.
Hey there, listener. Hope you're enjoying this episode and that you're remembering to hydrate, stretch, and unclench your jaws. Sometimes listening to conversations about heavy topics can really make you tighten up, you know? And remember, a little bit culty loves you.
Also, come hang out with us on Patreon after you finish this episode. It's fun over there. Fun is good. And now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga. Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like, I'm in Vancouver right now, and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. Hashtag cold pools, hashtag crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me, and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it, and I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist. And switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty. I feel like how she was victimized the most is having, well, the leveraged trust, right, with your dad, but also her leveraged fears, like that if she said no and walked out, she was going to lose your dad. And given her desire for family and thinking that that's what she was going to be building there, this bigger family, I also, painfully understand the decision, although it's, as a mom, it's just like, it's heartbreaking. And I'm also really sorry that you went through that. It would give me nightmares too. So what was the final straw for your mom that pushed her to leave finally?
I still almost sort of maybe don't know.
From your best guess of what she's told you.
I feel that there were a succession of things that led up to it. She has told me that for her, she feared the FBI raiding the community. She said that was the impetus for her. Now, I have a different idea, and I wrote about this in my book. But for her, she said that she saw the writing on the wall that child abuse was indeed a thing, this thing that she did not want to believe because she didn't want to believe that she had brought her child into a space where I was then vulnerable to abuse, or any other child for that matter. But that is what happened. That's what the space was. It was just a space of abuse for everybody. She saw 20 years in advance, actually, that we were being watched. And we were being watched by, government people, as they like to call it. I call it law enforcement, but, but that, we were being surveilled. And within that surveillance, there was obviously fraud taking place. But for her, it was more about what was happening with the children and how she was really afraid of losing me and then herself being sent to prison for, this situation. So that is what I was told. That is, I think, the place that she stands in, that she feared losing me forever. I think that that's part of it, but that this trust, this broken trust that we keep going back to, right? The broken trust of the community and what the community had sold my parents. So there was that. There were people leaving who were very close to her. There was another break in trust there. She did not think that these people would leave her, just like she did not want my father to leave her for this place. But then my father transgressed and she found out about it. He had an affair inside of this place. And I think that just really pushed her over the edge, because we're talking about a woman who had given up everything to keep this marriage together and to keep her family together. And this was an idea that he brought to her. And through extreme trepidation, she said yes. And so that betrayal, I think, was a step too far for her, because I want to remind listeners that we were not together, my family. It's not as though my mom could just go to my father's room and sit down and have time with him. That was not allowed at all. So the fact that he could find time for another woman was devastating. And I think that, if in my brain, adding all of those things up, no child, no husband, she's hungry all the time. Honestly, when we left, my mom is 5'9". She weighed 115 pounds.
Oh my God, that's so tiny. Tiny.
Yeah,
tiny.
that's how bone thin she was when we left this place. So the sacrifice that she made to then be betrayed in such an awful way, I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And she said, we are out of here. I cannot reconcile not having a marriage, thinking I have a marriage, and then hearing through the grapevine that my husband is unfaithful. Ouch.
Well, everything's gone.
It's all gone.
Everything
Yeah.
she sought to preserve is gone.
It's over.
Wow. She went through it. How is she now?
My mom is, without a doubt, the strongest person I have ever had the privilege of sitting down and interviewing and speaking with. I mean, I will say, this whole process of me working on this book, the whole process of me even interviewing her was not easy. She squirmed through everything.
I bet.
Everything, but her candor. I mean, she was so honest with me in ways where she was embarrassed at times, because obviously, hindsight is 2020. Of course, now she's, in her 60s. I mean, then she was in her 50s when we were going through the interview process. But, she could look back and say, oh my God, I was so dumb, and it's like, no, I don't see it as dumb anymore. I just see it as something different. It was a seeking moment, and a moment of extreme vulnerability and extreme desire, a lot of desire there. So I'm still waiting for her to forgive herself, for the community. I have forgiven her, and she is actually happy, as hard as this process was, that I have told this story, because she feels like secrets is part of what gets people into trouble. And so she's like, buck the system of secrets, So
Well, good for her.
she's great. She's great. And of course, therapy helps.
Well, secrets are the adhesive or the glue to abuse, right? So
That's
if you
right.
can
And shame.
expose those.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that in telling your story, in anyone's story, you have to take a bite out of the shame and sandwich and the embarrassment sandwich. And your capacity to do that directly correlates to how powerful your story is going to be, I think.
So back to healing. Obviously, this book must have been very cathartic, and you shared already what it was like interviewing your mom. So therapy, what else have you been doing to heal from, was it very intense childhood trauma, I would imagine?
I knew I was off. Yes. Growing up, I knew something was just, a little uncentered, but I couldn't source it, honestly, because, I was so young when the community happened. So I went through my childhood bouncing between extreme anger that I could not source, and then extreme joy that I also could not source. And it wasn't until I turned around 14 years old and I knew what the source was. I'd been having these dreams, these haunting dreams about this girl in this place, which was me, but I did not make the connection. So, finally, once I understood, okay, this place that I keep dreaming about that really frightens me, but I don't know who this little girl is and I'm scared for her. Once I realized that I was actually that girl, my entire head exploded. I mean, not literally, but, like my understanding and my perception of myself and my family and who I was and why I had been such a raging child. It all made sense at that moment. And then, of course, I had to spend the next few years of my life, right, going through my adolescence, which is awful for anybody. But for me, now I have the answer. And now I'm an adolescent with an answer. Everybody watch out. And it turned into that. I was like a fireball because I completely understood. Oh my goodness, my family walked away from me. Obviously, it was not that simple, but that was my adolescent brain, right? They were so silly that they let some man tell them what to do. It's not that simple, right? But I'm a child. This is how I am now understanding all this information that I have. So the way I processed it was I wrote. I did a lot of writing, a lot of journaling. Eventually, when I got older, I did a lot of traveling, and that was to escape everybody in New York, everybody in the United States, to just get away from it all. And as we said earlier about, creating our own identities, that's what I did, So whereas some people like to run to their family, I was like, bye, everybody, goodbye. And within that time, though, I got to know myself, right? I got to know what my boundaries are. I got to reconcile my understanding of my parents because now I'm at an age that they were, and I can see myself in them in a way that I wasn't able to as a child. And that ability really helped to open up healing for me and my parents. And for myself, I soon understood, okay, I hadn't done something wrong, which is a thing that I had thought for a very long time, which is why my parents would walk away from me. That was a thought that I had was I must have been a bad child, that they would leave me in a bad place alone. But, through talking to my mom, really, because my father does not like to talk about it. That's why I give her all the credit, really, is that she really helped me to understand what her thought process was and what she thought my father's thought process was, and how it wasn't an abandonment as much as it was a searching that I just got caught up in because I was their child.
The sentimentality as the pitch. That was the guitar solo of your book. It was so good. We replayed it I was like, wow, and it was so good. I love hearing different language to the same thing, and it was brilliant.
At what point, Jamiyla, in your healing journey, did you connect the dots that this was a cult? Or I don't know, how did you come to terms with a little bit culty or fully culty? What's your take on that? And where did you learn this?
I think I knew it was a little bit culty at that age of 14 when I got the answers to what that place was that I kept dreaming about. I was sure it was a cult when the Nubian nation went down. That was the confirmation that I needed that Dwight York was indeed a cult leader and not a religious scholar or a religious leader. The Nubian nation is what did it for me. So that was 2003. And the reason why I felt that was law enforcement confirmed it. The charges that was leveled against him, they were so heinous, they were awful. And then the fact that he was eventually convicted on these really awful charges. And granted, he was not convicted for being running a cult. I don't know if that's even a crime, but his machinations, right? The fact that what happened with the Nubian nation mirrored what had happened in the community, and that this was just, this was the way he operated. It became very clear to me that, if I can see the Nubian nation as a cult, I must see the community as one also.
Did your mom agree?
She does now. It took her some time.
Mm-hmm.
It took her some time because I think cult, that word, it's so loaded, and it's loaded in a way that I think make people who have been involved in one feel victimized or that they're dumb in some way.
Well, one thing I was going to say, sidebar for your mom, is have her watch season 1 and 2 of The Vow. And I think that she will feel less dumb and lots of forgiveness for herself and others. I've been told it's helpful in that way. Seriously, do you mind repeating in the best way that you can your beautifully written words about sentimentality and how that works to tap into people's vulnerabilities in this case.
Before I do that, do you mind if I read the source from where this thought came from?
Sure.
I could not include the quote in my epilogue, which I wanted to, because James Baldwin says it so much better than I do. But his meaning is the thing that really hits me. So James Baldwin, in Notes of a Native Son, he's talking basically about his own perspective, what it means to be a Black man in the United States. I think he did Notes of a Native Son in the 70s, I think. But the quote that he says is sentimentality, the ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion, is the mark of dishonesty. The inability to feel. The wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart. And it is always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent inhumanity, the mask of cruelty. That quote spoke to me so very much about what the community was built on. And what my argument is in that epilogue is that it was a community built on sentimentality. When I spoke earlier about the disenfranchisement of Black people in this country and the need to find and to have agency and self-empowerment, it's easy for someone like a Dwight York, I think, to then step in and be sentimental about what could be, right? We could be great. You could be the king. Your child doesn't have to face racism as long as you're in this space that we run, that we are in charge of, and that we have say over. And I think for a lot of people who said yes to this pitch, that it is in wanting something or remembering something maybe psychically. The reason why I say psychically for the community is Dwight York had a lot of teachings that was based on racism. A lot of it. It was very, very heavy in Black man is God. White people are dangerous devils. This is a very sentimental and a simplistic way of thinking about people. But if you can pit people against one another, and then the person who is feeling so trampled upon gets to be the one who tramples, gets to be the one who calls the shots. Oh, wow, so much. There's so much that one can do with that. And what I wanted to also show was that this idea of sentimentality as a monster is not exclusive to what happened within the community. I think a lot of people who fall vulnerable to cults, it is a lot about sentimentality. And when I watched January 6th, 2021 happen, to me, that was a culmination of a nationalistic, sentimental pitch by the former president.
That's what MAGA is.
That's what it is. It is, we want the old days, the good old days.
Right.
And those good old days are never coming back because they weren't good in the first place, right? So that's what I think Baldwin was describing in that quote, and what I liked so much about how it mirrored what I saw in the community, that level of vulnerability, that need that you're so blinded, you can't even see, your periphery, is the same thing that I see with MAGA.
Well, you said it best, that they miss sentimentality as the pitch.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was so,
because
wow.
I think that is the pitch. Yeah.
When you were speaking just now, I realized why your book was so emotional was that I feel like it answers, potentially a way out of what is very much a divided world right now.
Romanticizes it as well.
Yeah.
Too, right?
I mean, I think we're a year apart. You born in 76?
I was.
Yeah. So born in 77, a white Canadian, very different backdrop.
You picked a good country.
Thank you. Yeah. Very different
that.
backdrop. Yeah. Different backdrop, obviously. But separate from your pop cultural references of, Janet Jackson and, the music you were listening to and Sinead O'Connor in the background. I guess what I'm trying to say is sometimes my emotion takes the better of me. Sorry, Jamiyla, I'm trying to put words to this, but there's like this feeling of the pain that you're specifically, I guess your dad and your mother were feeling at that time and how that drove them. And then how that was used to create, like what you just said, the opposite of what I think we all want. We all want to feel belonging in this world, not just within a community. We want to feel it in the world and be different and have our differences and feel accepted and safe. I think we all want that. And these leaders prey on that pain and pit us against each other in a way that's so binary, so divisive, and so literally black and white.
Well, your good gets leveraged.
Yeah, I guess that's what just hit me in a way that I hadn't felt before. And we all got into these things for different reasons. When I heard you say that part about sentimentalism, I read it to Nippy because his draw into Nexium was a totally different draw than for me, but it was about that, like hearkening to
it was ideology. It was,
Yeah.
it was looking at the behavior of our leaders. And then there's a book called Death of Outrage that I had read like a week before I had rolled up to take a training. And it was similar, less so a marketing campaign like MAGA is, but it was also hearkening back to like a day of like when we had leaders that spoke about ideas. And this guy was speaking about ideas, and the reason I asked about the age, because I was 26, 27.
We were also young.
I was like, the ecosystem of where do I
That's
go
right.
wasn't clear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, those are very ripe ages.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's right before we figure out exactly who we are and what our line in the sand is.
Exactly. And you mentioned boundaries earlier, and boundaries are a big one. One other thing I don't want to leave the interview without mentioning, because someone asked you a pointed question and I don't remember the exact question, but it was like, what do you do? And you said, look out for your children.
Oh, yeah.
And that one to me was like, because Sarah and I, we have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, and whatever system we put them into and what schooling and whatever, it's tumultuous right now because no domain has been left alone from politicizing a lot of things right now. And I just want our kids to be kids, and I want to protect them from that, and I want to keep that as long as we can. So that response to me made me really excited to interview you, and how you articulate things is I learned, which is great.
That was my job.
Well, you're an educator. You are an educator.
Yeah, your story's wisdom, and it was certainly wisdom for me. And thank you for sharing.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. I really do. Because as I said, a writer never knows how words will hit with someone else.
Also, someone's always going to have a problem.
And then
with
there's
it,
that,
right?
yeah.
And I think it's important to, bond with people that are telling stories and let them know that it worked and it's working. And I'm gonna walk away from your story more informed about how I'm gonna go out into the world.
Oh, that makes me feel so good inside.
Period! Exclamation point. So thank you.
It's true.
And you're absolutely right. We have to look out for our kids. We do. It's our job.
Yeah.
That's our job. Yeah.
Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to say that before we share with our audience where people can find you?
I think the only thing I will say is that I hope my book is it's a love story, right? It's a cultural retelling. It is a story about a cult. But at the end of the day, for me also, I hope that it is a story that gets readers to think deeper about what's coming at them and why something is being presented to them. And I'm not saying to be overly cautious as we move through this world, because I like trusting people, but we should always be a little critical. And I fear that a lot of the MAGA stuff is a lack of critical thinking.
It's a lack of critical thinking, but I think people who are too lazy to do the critical thinking.
Yeah, it's possibly.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and they're riled up.
I look at your journey, and it started with judgment.
Mm-hmm. Big time.
Right. And once you took the time to be a journalist about it, which is effort, critical thinking requires effort. That's why most people judge. That's not my quote. I read that somewhere. So that's not mine. But I think ultimately, if you're able to do that, then you get the wisdom and you expand your sphere of thinking and understanding. So
this was really fun, actually. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Likewise.
We appreciate you. I'm going to give it to my mom for Hanukkah because we have our own different journey post-cult, and I think she'll appreciate it.
And if anything, there's a good mother-daughter story there.
Yes, it's definitely a good mother-daughter story, for sure. Thank you. Please keep in touch and let us know how we can support you.
Absolutely. Same here.
got emotional.
I did. I got emotional. How was that?
Well, I mean, like I told her, I was informed,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with the sentimentality as a pitch. I thought it was just a different way of hearing it, right?
Yeah. It's like a more elaborate understanding of the idealism. And crazy that after this happened in the community, he went to upstate New York. I wonder if he ever crossed paths with Keith, A. And B, she used a term to describe him that I've also said about Alan, I should call him, not Keith, that he was stealing souls.
Yeah, I heard that.
And I thought that was something that's interesting that she made that analogy as well, but also specifically pointing out that like the most insidious part of it is he makes it look like people are choosing because they're choosing, but that there's always that bait and switch. If you love this episode, please do read her book. It will link to it in the show notes. Again, it's called The Community. Oh, and I also forgot to mention, if you look it up, the cover of it, I think is really interesting because it totally, for me, it's a visual representation of the fragmentation of being in a cult, the different pieces put together of the White House and the memoir element with the backdrop. And it's like all the pieces are there in a sort of stained glass.
Suffice to say, there's really a lot to this Jamila's book, and we're going to put the link in our show notes. Again, it's called The Community, and it goes way more into detail than we ever could in the episode.
Yeah. And not just about the cult, like she said, mother-daughter story, forgiveness story. And just to wrap up, really helping people understand what happens when people are desperate or disenfranchised and how people will give up and what people will give up for freedom, acceptance, and love. And also, how does a family heal after experiencing life-altering betrayals? Check out our book. Come and join us over on the Patreon. And thanks for joining. Bye for now.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Hope you liked this episode. Let's keep the conversation going and come hang out with us on Patreon, where we keep the tape rolling each week with special episodes just for Patreon subscribers and where we get deep into the weeds of unpacking every episode of The Vow.
And if you're looking for our show notes or some sweet, sweet swag or official ALBC podcast merch or a list of our most recommended cult recovery resources, visit our website at alittlebitculty.com.
And for more background on what brought us here, check out Sarah's page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, narrated by my wife, and at most bookstores.
A Little Bit Culty is a Talkhouse podcast and a Trace 120 production. We're executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, with writing, research, and additional production support by senior producer Jess Tardy. We're edited, mixed, and mastered by our rocking producer Will Rutherford of Citizens of Sound, and our amazing theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant and co-written by Nigel Asselin. Thank you for listening.
So have you
Exactly.
ever done a show in PVC?
Yeah, man. I did a tour in PVC and I regret it a little bit. I do, man. I regret it a little bit. So it's like, it wasn't very flattering on the top and then my knob was showing the whole time.
Moving right along.
Anyway, moving along.
Mum's like, I don't want to talk about your knob.
I don't want to talk about your
Not right now.
Not right now. I'll do it after the cameras are off.
So yes, you will.
Billboard chart-topping singer and songwriter Youngblood joins the Osbournes podcast. Listen now wherever you get podcasts.